Welcome to APUSH. Today we're going to explore Frederick Taylor's vision of scientific management and how the streamlining of American work changed the way that Americans thought about professions and the economy in general. So here are your basic objectives for today. Take a moment and pause and take them in, and then we'll dive into our narrative from here. So, in order to understand Taylorism, you need to basically understand how the American economy was changing with the rise of mass production. Taylor's goal was to take advantage of increased mechanization by trying to turn humans more into or make humans work more like machines. And so the goal is to streamline the work process and to organize people into basically doing very similar tasks all day in order to maximize their efficiency. And so it's like a proto assembly line before we had the mechanized assembly line thing. This, of course, means that there needs to be a substantial division of labor because someone, of course, needs to direct this. And so Taylor also advocated dividing the workforce into various levels of management in order to more or less ensure accountability for each of the other levels. And so this greater stratification of the workforce, on the one hand, created a bunch of jobs, these manager jobs that aren't actually producing anything. But theoretically, if these managers are making the people below them work more efficiently, then even if they're not part of the productive process, they are part of creating a more efficient and streamlined workforce. And so that's the basic idea behind Taylorism. You divide the day up and you have people do specific tasks, and then you have them transition at specific times, with the idea being that you're maximizing people's efficiency at any individual moment. And so the best way to understand Taylorism is to understand our school day. Our school day is based off of a Tayloristic system in which you are supposed to work on a single task for approximately 47 minutes to maximize your efficiency and then transition to another task, with a manager or teacher theoretically holding you accountable, with the administrators then holding the teachers accountable, and the central office staff holding the administrators accountable. So you exist in this Tayloristic system, and it profoundly affects the way that you live your life. And so this is, of course, going to be a massive transition for most Americans who up until now had been often still working on guilds and having individual craftsmen creating goods from start to finish. Now, all of a sudden, you're only responsible for one part of the productive process, which, of course, is a huge change. And so at the same time, we're going to see increasing efficiency. And then, of course, as this expands into more industries, an increasing number of workers. And so a larger percentage of the American workforce is now going to be involved in manufacturing, of course, moving away from agriculture and other more traditional pursuits. You're seeing this especially in fields like ironwork, oil refining, stuff like that, that requires much more specialized skills than some of the previous occupations. And that's, of course, going to have a very profound effect on society as well. This divide between skilled and unskilled labor is going to create some pretty substantial problems because traditionally craftsmen would have to be incredibly skilled, sort of developing their craft over the course of a lifetime in order to become a master. But with Taylor making production into a more machine-like process, you can now be plugged in to simply be a cog in the machine. So as opposed to someone who's able to work independently and has more or less control over their own life, now these interchangeable low skilled workers don't need to have the same education level, can be paid significantly less, and they can be replaced much more easily. So on the one hand, you have significantly larger number of people coming into the workforce, but on the other hand, these people are much less individually valuable, and so their wages are going to fall, which is of course going to lead to some issues. This is, of course, going to lead to one of the issues it leads to is the labor movement is going to adjust to try to create this or to try to deal with this issue. So, groups like the National Labor Union are going to try to advocate for 8-hour workdays for workers. The Knights of Labor, which we'll be talking about later, are going to try to focus on specifically unionizing skilled workers and protecting their wages from unskilled workers. And then eventually, the American Federation of Labor is going to pick up that sort of mantle and try to really solidify the position of skilled workers within the workforce, in contrast to these sort of interchangeable Tayloristic drones. Women are also going to take a much larger share of the workforce as physical strength and specific training and education become less important, because, of course, these things would have been less available to women. And so we're going to see more and more women moving into these factories, and also, of course, children. This replaced some traditional female uh, careers, such as maids, domestic servants, nurses, nannies, things like that, as more young women were moving to urban areas in order to take on these new manufacturing jobs. African Americans would also be stepping in mostly as unskilled labor. And this is going to lead to some pretty significant problems in cities of the North as the Great Migration, which we talked about before, continues. Of course, some African Americans, as they migrated out of the South, moved out west to try to start up farms. But an increasing number started to move away from Jim Crow laws to cities of the North, where they settled in these enclaves with other groups of people of color in order to basically support each other and protect against discrimination, and to create this sense of community. And so it's, on the one hand, going to create greater opportunities for Black people, but also create significant resentment from both skilled and unskilled white laborers who saw these African Americans as competition, and it brought out all the horrible racist stereotypes that always show up when these types of situations happen, or when you get African Americans moving into these new areas. But it did lead to community associations for African Americans in cities of the North to both encourage migration and, of course, to support African Americans as they move into these new areas. All of this, of course, is going to greatly shift the perspective of the American dream. Going back to the earliest days of our country, the American dream was to have a small farm, to be Thomas Jefferson's prototypical perfect American, living independent as a yeoman farmer out on the frontier, surviving and thriving based on the sweat of your brow and your own accomplishments. Obviously, this is becoming much less possible for people. And so now a healthy, comfortable living within cities starts to replace this rural ideal as the American dream. And so, as we're going to talk about later, you get increasing demands for leisure activities for urban Americans to spend their extra time and their money on, especially as unions start to slowly whittle away that 14-hour workday down to 12, 10, and then eventually even 8 hours. Of course, for urban Americans, this American dream is very different, and it's a very different sort of vision of the middle class. Horatio Alger, as I think we talked about earlier, wrote approximately 1 billion books in which a small town kid moves to the big city and succeeds based on his own grit and individual drive. So this starts to become sort of the vision of American success. And I'm assuming you can probably guess the plot of this book from the title, but it's another Horatio Alger book that sort of, again, follows that same path. This new vision of the middle class mirrors the previous vision of the middle class, except it is significantly more urban. And so this is, of course, going to change the type of activities and things that they do. We're, of course, looking for slightly better housing, the ability to buy some fancier clothes, and then to be able to go out and to restaurants, which start becoming a thing, or amusement parks, which we'll talk about later, which start becoming a thing, or the theater. And of course, to be able to buy some luxuries, like, hey, look, it's toy furniture for your children. For only 59 cents, you can get 7 pieces, and it's all solid wood. What an exciting and wonderful luxury. And look, a banjo. And so the vision of the middle class that starts emerging here is the ability to buy some toy furniture and potentially a banjo. One of the other components of this is as the middle class grows in prosperity, we start to get more middle class reformers interested in reform. The social gospel is the idea that Christians have a incentive or have a duty in order to improve the lives of the less fortunate. And so, as part of this sort of continued Second Great Awakening, we see more Protestants getting involved in this whole social gospel movement in order to try to better the lives of people. The most famous of these social gospelers was Jane Addams. She founded the Hull House, which is the first what's called settlement house. They're basically community centers providing basic services to people and also attempting to adjust people to this new city life by providing cultural events and get-togethers and building playgrounds where apparently children can go when they're not working, which is weird. And so the goal is basically to improve people's lives. And so you start seeing these larger urban social gatherings sort of replacing some of the traditional country relaxation activities and social activities. Finally, we see the growth of mass transit during this time period. As we start getting things like the elevated train and then eventually the subway, this allows laborers and especially middle class managers to move further outside the city center. The L train in Chicago was built during this time period, as we see here. And so, as the streetcar and these other mass transit systems start being built up, people start moving further out from the sort of densely populated city, and we get the beginning of the rise of the suburb as we know it. And the suburb, of course, has the advantage of not being as crowded, not being as polluted. Maybe you could have a little patch of grass outside your house that you could spend some time in when you weren't working. And so, this is, of course, also going to change American life. And so the beginning of urban sprawl leads to the incorporation of new neighborhoods that are sometimes their own sort of a political unit outside of cities that tend to have politics that are somewhat different from the city center. Finally, we have farmers during this time period. Obviously, all of these developments are not ideal for farmers, despite the fact that still the vast majority of Americans are involved in agriculture. And so we start getting movements to try to raise the status of farmers. So, in order to try to counter these growing narratives, what we're going to end up seeing is the Grange movement, which is more or less a propaganda movement to convince people that like farmers are important. And so they put out awesome posters like this, which is basically the equivalent of those one Kansas farmer feeds however many people signs you see up along the highway, reminding us that, hey, people still farm and it's kind of important and you should think about them. And then eventually the Grange is going to evolve into the more political Farmers Alliance, which starts advocating for / pushing policies in order to help farmers who are really struggling because of all of the things we talked about in previous lectures. Of course, for the more urbane middle class city dwellers, they view these Grangers as political hayseeds, outsiders, hillbillies, and try to ignore them. But they start to become a more potent political force. And then eventually they're going to morph into the populist movement that we're going to be talking about in a few lectures. So the Farmers Alliance starts advocating for policies to help farmers and to counter the sort of growing urbanization of the United States. So that brings us to our conclusion here. Hopefully you can answer these questions, and then we'll continue to move on exploring the politics of the Gilded Age and reform next